Hello and welcome to Subject to Change with me, Russell Hogg. And this is part two of a two-part podcast with Edward Shawcross about Napoleon III. So welcome back, Ed, to the podcast.
Delighted to be here again.
So as I said at the end of part one, it seems to me that you can't really discuss the life of Napoleon III without talking about his mistresses. And actually, I think it would be a brilliant podcast series to talk about the lives of each of these, well, some of them quite remarkable women. And obviously, we don't have time to do them justice, but can you just talk a bit about, I mean, I don't quite know how to describe this, but talk about Napoleon III's love life?
Absolutely. Well, you're right. I mean, it needs a podcast series in itself. It's a great idea. And I mean, so the 1850s, 1860s, Paris, it's sort of the great era of, I suppose, the kind of the courtesan, with these figures who, for incredible sums, will put themselves on the arms of rich and powerful men. So you have that, and these women like Cora Pearl, who's not actually a mistress of Napoleon III, but a mistress of his cousin, who become incredibly wealthy and famous in Paris. But let's go back a little bit and focus on Napoleon III. So if you were listening to the previous episode, you'll have heard me make reference to the fact that his partner couldn't be the First Lady of France because she was entirely disrespectful for such an elevated position. And so I think let's start with Harriet Howard, a remarkable woman. She was born in 1823, real name Elizabeth Ann Harriet, I believe, but came to be known as Harriet Howard. She was born the daughter of a Brighton bootmaker in the sort of back streets of Brighton. She had ambitions beyond that. She wanted to become an actor, which her parents found shocking and even worse than sex worker in the 19th century for some. So she ran away. She sort of worked her way up. She became the mistress of a jockey and then a very wealthy English army officer who she had an illegitimate son with. And that took her into sort of high society, St. John's Wood, which was a place of sort of sex and scandal back in the day. I don't think it is anymore. She eventually meets Louis Napoleon, and she's meant to be astonishingly beauty. She's sort of compared to kind of sort of Olympian ideals of beauty from the classical age. And Louis Napoleon becomes hooked. Now, he is a consummate charmer and womanizer, for want of a better word. But remarkably long-lasting relationship, Harriet Howard. And he gets lodgings quite close to his in London. And which sort of shows the seriousness of the relationship, when he becomes president, he insists that she comes to France with him. And in fact, I very excitingly, for me, probably for no one else, stumbled across a copy, well, not the copy, her passport in the archives that's signed by none other than Palmerston as foreign secretary. Oh. So there you go. If you've got friends in high places, you can get your mistress across to France as president. Now, the problem with Harriet Howard, from the French point of view, is one that her name is absolutely unpronounceable if you're French, because you've got too many H's. But also, she's British, right? So you can't have the first lady of France being a sort of British daughter of a bootmaker. So it's absolutely scandalous. And she comes around with Louis Napoleon on his provincial tours. He's a trailblazer in many ways, and not least because he sets her up in accommodation very close to the Elysee, so he can go to see her in the evenings and hang out with her. She doesn't speak much French. They go for rides together in the park, though. And he has a real affection for her, although not exclusively for her, it should be said. But as he's launched his coup d'etat, and as we'll get into, he's going to become emperor. Now, it's one thing to have a mistress as president. It's quite another to have one who you're going for rides with in the park or appears in the opera as emperor. And so it's decided that he has to found a dynasty and has to marry, and he marries Eugenie in 1853. Harriet Howard is bought off an astronomical price. So he hasn't told her he's getting married, Harriet Howard, poor Harriet Howard.
Oops.
He's told her that there's a scandal breaking in England where love letters from a previous lover have been discovered. She needs to go to England and buy up those letters and destroy them, to stop the scandal going into the press. Now, unfortunately for Louis Napoleon, this brilliant plan is ruined by the fact that the steamer, which is meant to depart on the evening of January 22nd, is delayed by a storm. The next day, Harriet Howard comes down, she opens Le Moniteur Universel, government newspaper, and sees that her lover and long-term boyfriend is getting married. She's understandably annoyed by this. She refuses to go to England, and she immediately driven back to Paris, where she goes to her apartment to find it has been ransacked. And the president, the emperor as he is then, has sent his secret police to confiscate and then destroy his love letters to her. And in all of my archival research, I only managed to find one very brief note, which is just seen this afternoon for a drive in the park, which is very anodyne and not. And the people are looking for sex scandals. That's not quite it, is it? But this is so. But she is not a woman to fade away quietly. So she positions herself ostentatiously on the route, but which Eugénie and Louis Napoleon drive into Paris from Saint-Cloud, the summer palace, and salutes the emperor every time they go past. Now, if you can imagine you're newly married, Eugénie is very, we can discuss it more later, but she's traditional conservative, let us say, in her politics and her private life. And so having the incredibly glamorous mistress, daughter of a Brighton bootmaker, salute you every time you go past in the carriage is not something Louis Napoleon wants. So he buys her off. He gets her an aristocratic title. He gets her a chateau outside of Paris, conveniently located quite close to some of his own summer palaces, but also money. And she ends up with the millions of francs, which in English money today, if you put it into the inflation calculator, we're talking something like £30 million. That's not a bad buy-off, is it? So she's some of the first of, I suppose, the big names, although there have been others. And they're often involved in his coups d'etats. Actually, he likes to use a mistress in his plots and conspiracies before he comes to power. So after he's married to Eugénie, he tells Matilda, in fact, his one-time fiancée, that he was faithful to her for 6 months, which is not as long as he was faithful to the constitution he had sworn to uphold as president. So it's just, if I'm doing very terrible at maths in my head, I think he lasted nearly three years faithful to the constitution, 6 months faithful to his wife before he embarks on what he calls his little distractions. But they're quite big distractions, actually, often take him away from important affairs of state. And sometimes even they are literally affairs of state, because probably the second big name is Virginia. She's an Italian countess, Castiglione. She's a distant cousin of Cavour, the prime minister of Piedmont, Sardinia, whose lifelong dream is to unite Italy under the auspices of Piedmont and the Italian monarchy, which he does indeed do. And so he sends his cousin, Virginia, to Paris, and he writes a fantastic letter where he says, I've enrolled her in the diplomatic corps, and her mission is to seduce the emperor if she gets the chance, and report back his pillow talk to Piedmont. Now, it's I always think that I like that letter because it says seduce him if she gets a chance. You don't have, it's mission easy. This one, this is not mission difficult, or it's certainly not mission impossible. So she is an incredibly glamorous woman, and she the great fashion of the day is crinoline, these enormous voluminous dresses that Eugénie is in part responsible for promoting and making ubiquitous in London and Paris and across the sort of Western world. It's a terrible choice of dress for a number of reasons, not least because it's very dangerous to the wearer. Lots of wearers die. You stand too close to a fire, you don't know, the fabric goes up. If there's a gust of wind, you get blown in front of a carriage and trampled, or you just trip over it going down the stairs. That's not a problem for Virginia because she doesn't wear crinoline dresses. She wears figure-hugging, tight dresses without corset. Very shocking. Levels of ankle on display that are, men and women covering their eyes when she comes into a ballroom. And so, she catches Louis Napoleon's eye very quickly. And the two become lovers. It's scandalous, not least because she's reporting state secrets back to Piedmont, but also she gets an apartment conveniently located, as they all do. It's a great real estate move to become the mistress of Louis Napoleon, and this is again something the French presidents. He's been a trailblazer in this. So secret assignations, and his bodyguard are always furious that they have to sort of traipse across Paris in the dead of night because they're worried that people are trying to assassinate him, which indeed they do. On one of his visits to Virginia, he gets tired of her quite quickly. He doesn't hide her affairs though from Eugénie, and she's furious. So huge arguments and clothes being thrown out of the Tuileries Palace in Paris or wherever they're staying. But as I say, he does tire of her. He moves on to a woman called Anna Valeska. Now this is interesting for a number of reasons. She's married to his foreign minister, who also happens to be an illegitimate son of Napoleon through his Polish mistress.
Oh my goodness.
Yeah, so this is very much, I mean, it adds a whole new frisson to discussing foreign affairs, doesn't it? If you know that your wife is sleeping with the emperor, and we also know that you are, I suppose, a cousin. Yes, it's quite extraordinary. He'd also shared a mistress with another cousin, Plon Plon, who we'll probably talk about more, who was the lover of the great French actress Rachel. But had initially been Louis Napoleon's mistress in London, and Louis Napoleon accompanied her on a northern tour to Manchester with Plon Plon, and Louis Napoleon fell asleep in the train carriage and woke up to find his cousin straddling his lover at the time. And I think it reflects very well on Louis Napoleon that he just pretended to go back to sleep. And when they got to Manchester, got the next train back to London, but didn't make a fuss about it. But I suppose he could hardly criticise such behaviour. So you've got Anna Valeska, and this again, another embarrassing incident on train carriage. So he doesn't hide his affairs. Eugenie and Matilda, so his current wife and former fiance, are in the imperial train in one carriage. The jolting of the train means that the door swings open, and Eugenie sees her husband straddling the foreign minister's wife in the train carriage. So there's sort of sex scandals and train carriages, a bit of a running theme. Eugenie quite likes her because she is what I suppose we would say classy. She's an aristocrat.
Gosh.
And by now she doesn't tolerate the affairs, but has, I suppose, become slightly broken or beaten down or inured to them, whatever the word is, but not to the next one. Because the next one, Louis Napoleon makes a great thing of being a Democrat and a man of the people. And this is Marguerite Bellanger. She's from French peasant stock, changes the name, moves to Paris, becomes as one of those courtesans, as I mentioned, and works her way up to the position of imperial mistress, which by now has become something of an official position, almost like a cabinet position, as it were. And so Eugenie thinks she is scum. That's her word, not mine, because of her humble origins. And she had been a circus artist. She'd been a sort of a horse rider who could do sort of amazing things on a horse. She was said to be able to go from lying on her back to standing in a single spring, talents to which I'm sure she was able to make use of outside of the circus. So Eugenie is so shocked by this, and there are rumors that Louis Napoleon has had an illegitimate child by her, that she actually goes to visit her and offers her a huge sum of money to disappear, which of course is soon gossiped about in the salons of Paris that we mentioned earlier and causes outrageous scandal. She has to go into hiding. Louis Napoleon sends one of his secretaries to track her down. She finds her in a small village outside of Paris, waiting for the scandal to die down, surrounded by jugs of cider and wearing clogs. So she's gone back to her peasant origins. And she calls him Dear Lord, is the name that she uses for him. And she writes him a very apologetic letter apologizing for the rumors about the paternity of the child and saying that she had her doubts, but she hopes that she can find forgiveness from her dear lord and that she loves him. And she's incredibly grateful for everything that he's done for her. And she should be grateful because, once again, she is remunerated to astronomical sums. I mean, this is the extinction of pauperism in action. This is the social mobility that Bonapartism has at the heart of the project. Both Harriet Howard and Marguerite Bellanger have become enormously rich from extremely poor backgrounds. So this is, you can point to the policies working. Obviously, you can't sleep with everyone in France, but it does seem that he tries. There's a wonderful account of his seduction technique. So a secret rendezvous is arranged earlier in the day with one of the women at court. So this is a spectacular court that he sets up, which largely seems to be the sort of 19th century equivalent of Tinder for him. And he arranges the meeting at 1:30 in upstairs in her room in one of the chateaus. And he comes in billowing imperial purple pajamas, noticeable, she says, only by his distinctive wax moustache silhouetted against the light of the door that he's closed, stumbles over to the furniture and seduces her. And she notes that it only took half an hour to make her an empress. Make that what you will. Which I suppose, if you are a serial philanderer, then quantity and efficiency is more important than anything else, right? If you've got various meetings to get through, as it were. So those are probably the biggest names. The last mistress, who is quite important, Mercy-Argenteau, she claims that it was platonic, but she also claims that they met up through a secret tunnel between the Elysee and her house. And I don't know, he doesn't strike me as a platonic man when it comes to women. But anyway, maybe she had to put that. That was in her memoirs, which are hugely entertaining. she's important, but she's important, and she's fully the last holder of the semi-official imperial mistress. But she actually gets involved in shenanigans involving the Franco-Prussian War, which we're probably getting too far ahead of ourselves. So that's, as I said, that's a kind of introduction to the mistresses of Louis Napoleon. But as you say, it could be a series, or indeed a volumes of books, given how extraordinary some of these women were, and the situations that they got into.
I read somewhere that they had these great hunting parties out at somewhere called Compiègne or somewhere like that.
Yeah.
And I read somewhere that at Compiègne they have this sort of private theatre for the guests, and that Napoleon III tried to arrange the seating plan so he could ogle all the beauties of the amongst the guests, and his wife was desperately trying to rearrange the seating plan so that the dowdy ones were kind of lined up in front of him. Is this true?
Well, there's a lot of these shenanigans, and of course, as with any regime, there are scandalous rumors and scurrilous propaganda, and a lot of it misogynistic, and semi-pornographic. But he is absolutely as I say, a man with an eye for the ladies, and how far? I mean, he is, Victor Hugo, for example, is endlessly talking about orgies that have been organised and so on and so forth. I think it's more. Innocent's probably not the right word. It's less debauched. It's more targeted. But yes, he absolutely. I mean, if he sees an attractive woman, whether he's rearranging the seating plan, he probably doesn't need to. Then he will pursue them. But he's a very affable, charming individual, and he's emperor. So I suppose he's not short on opportunity. Eugenie she's the opposite. She's incredibly conservative, very chaste. She gives birth to a son, the Prince Imperial, as he becomes known, in 1856. And it's an incredibly difficult, agonizing labour that lasts for hours, and is rescued, Louis Napoleon's own words, by the doctor finally intervening with forceps. So it's a hugely traumatic experience. She's worried that if she has another pregnancy, she will die. It's very likely that she stops having sex with Louis Napoleon after 1856. Whether that, I mean, he was a serial philanderer before that, but I suppose that might provide at least some rationale for his continued extramarital exploits, as it were, but that perhaps intensifies it rather than causes it, because he's engaged in these activities, while they're married, while she's pregnant, and while they have a son.
So I guess moving away from what we might call domestic affairs, I mean, you say that he's sort of, well, gosh, it's all very distracting, all these women that he's chasing around Paris like some sort of a Franco Benny Hill show. But he does get quite a lot done, doesn't he? I mean, there's the war in Italy, which I thought was quite interesting because, as I understand it, he goes there himself. There's the Crimean War. There's all sorts of things being done in and around Paris and in France generally. So what's happening in terms of his getting stuff done program?
Yes, we've not done much for his historical reputation, because there's the famous Marx quote about the coup d'etat of 2nd December 1851, which is the first time as tragedy, the second time as farce, and we've lent heavily into the farce and the mistresses, and in fact the accusation that he spent too much time on affairs was something that Eugenie herself would tell ambassadors, and ambassadors' wives when in conversation, because she was so upset by it. She would say, it's outrageous, he's seeing this such and such woman, he should be concentrating on politics. He does get a lot done, especially in the first decade in the 1850s. So we'll start with foreign policy, perhaps, and then move to domestic. In terms of foreign policy, he has an astonishing success. So the first few years of the regime, there's nothing farcical about them at all. As I say, millions of people have endorsed him as president, and then in the plebiscite. And the Crimean War is a tremendous diplomatic and military success for France, because what it allows him to do is end France's isolation after 1815 and the treaties of Vienna, which had been designed to contain France, to some extent humiliate France, take a lot of French territory, but also isolate it diplomatically. In the Crimean War, Napoleon III is able to ally with Britain, the great enemy of Napoleon. So this is an extraordinary kind of changing shift in the geopolitics of the continent. Defeat Russia, which of course Napoleon had less than stellar record with, right? There's a French army goes to Crimea. take Sevastopol after a long siege. There's the Battle of the Alma. I mean, all these battles would be familiar because they're the same battles, of course, that the British are involved in. And it's not only does it end French isolation, so there's a fantastic peace conference in Paris in 1856 with a wonderful bit of diplomatic trolling. There's a portrait of Napoleon I looking down on all of the powers that, of course, had fought so hard to end him. It must have been like a reoccurring nightmare for Austria and Prussia and Russia and the likes to see this. But it showed the French army to be one of the leading military forces in the world. So if people know about the Crimean War, they tend to know about the charge of the Light Brigade and just enormous British incompetence. And if it weren't for the French, it would have been a disaster. It's the French army compared to the British and indeed the Russian. Now, it should be said, these are low bars. It perhaps gives the French overconfidence, right? But the French army, compared to those two, is a well-trained, well-supplied, well-led force. The officers tend to go to officer school, unlike the British, who buy their commissions, hence why you have Lord Raglan and the infamous vague order to just charge, suicidally towards the Russian guns. That has the wonderful French general who says, c'est magnifique, mais ce n'est pas la guerre. It's magnificent, but it's not war. Having said that we'll get into some pretty futile cavalry charges that the French undertake later. And so it shows France to be, the military superpower, if you will, that defeats Russia, that bails out Britain, the diplomatic power as well. And then, as you say, in 1859, again, people, if we've managed to retain any listeners, they'll remember that Louis Napoleon was obsessed with Italian nationalism. Right, he had taken part in a revolt that aimed at some kind of unified Italian state, and it never left him. And I think partially because it's so tied up with the death of his brother, who he absolutely adored and loved. So in 1859, he very cynically, in Machiavellian style, engineers a war with Austria to drive Austria out of Lombardy, Venetia, the two provinces that Austria controls in Italy. He's doing this in alliance with Piedmont, Sardinia, who will take over these provinces. And he leads the army himself. So in 1859, he leads the French army along with its Italian allies to fight the Austrians. And of course, all of this is just the weight of history weighs heavily upon everyone's shoulders. This is a famous battlegrounds that Napoleon made his name. Mm-hmm. And his proclamation to the army, it says, today's army of Italy will recall the glories of the former army of Italy, and so on and so forth. And he wins 2 battles. He wins the Battle of Magenta, after which the colour is named. The colour, I think, has been more enduring than the battle. And then Solferino, which is the largest battle in Europe since the Battle of Nations outside Leipzig in 1813. So it's big scale. He's the commander. Franz Joseph is the commander-in-chief of the opposing army at Solferino. So he's defeated the Austrians. He's defeated the Russians. He's organised a peace in 1856, again in 1859. It very quickly unravels. But if we stay at 1859 and don't go too far ahead, that you can make a case that in foreign policy, he has made good on his promise to make France great again. Right, one of the great criticisms of the July monarchy was that it was weak, it was peace at any price, it was surrendering French honor. And of course, this is 19th century, the time when national honor is something that motivates, people, and perhaps much more than it does today. So he seems to have made good on that promise. We'll switch to domestic policy. Again, it's a tremendous success. He has a really radical, innovative approach to economic policy, which is that economic growth should be at the heart of government. And so what he does is he reforms the French banking industry to allow cheap credit to pump through the economy. Railway expansion triples under the Second Empire, all of the knock-on effects of that in iron and steel and production. Luxury industries as well, which you associate with France, champagne, silk, etc. It's booming, not least silk because of the extravagant court and parties and so on and so forth. Exports are on the up, and what they're doing is they're borrowing money to invest. And the centerpiece is Paris, which he transforms from people knew London for the fog and the smog. People knew Paris for the smell, open sewers, human excrement running through the streets. And I don't want any unkind listeners to say that hasn't been 100% solved.
Louis, ça change.
It's too.
No, it's
a gift. But so it's demolishing medieval Paris, which is a warren of hovels and shacks straight out of a Victor Hugo novel. And into the wide boulevards, the apartments, the parks, the Paris we know today that is beloved of tourists is created in the 1850s and 1860s. And it's a radical project, they say, because they borrow eye-watering sums with no democratic oversight to pay for it. But it is provides employment and is largely lauded today. I mean, it's very controversial at the time, but largely lauded today as a fairly successful attempt at urban regeneration and redesign. And of course, his political system itself, which is authoritarian. There is little freedom of the press. There are elections, but there's opposition. What they can do is limited. And that the elections have resulted in resounding successes for officially government-backed candidates. So the government tells you who to vote for. You don't have to vote for them, but they recommend very strongly that you do. And that all seems to be a roaring success in the 1850s. So in terms of the economy to politics, foreign policy, the 1850s have been tremendously successful for France.
I do quite a lot of podcasts on the history of Japan, mainly with the excellent Jonathan Clements, who always has interesting angles on these things. And famously, Meiji Japan sends expeditions around the world trying to find things to copy, and they want the best of everything. So, the British Navy and, bits from America and from France. I think they get the law inexplicably, and they also they copy the French army. And what Jonathan Clements told me was that quite soon after they've made the decision to copy the French army, because it's considered to be the best in the world, they change their mind and they start copying the Prussian one. So do you just want to explain why the Japanese changed from the French to the Prussians?
Right, yes. Well, I think it was a good change. So Prussia, we haven't mentioned, and if you remember your Napoleonic history, we like in Britain to say that we won the Battle of Waterloo, but Prussia plays a significant role. Prussia is going to be a thorn in the side of the third Napoleon as well. So through the 1850s, there was lots of success domestically and abroad. The 1860s, things begin to unravel. So Italy turns into something of a disaster because the settlement that Napoleon III wants, which is a very kind of moderate monarchist form of nationalism, gives way to a much more radical vision, particularly Garibaldi. He ends up helping create a unified Italian state, and that unified Italian state is not necessarily in France's interest, right? Because now you've got a major power to deal with on your border. Much worse, of course, is Prussia and a certain character called Otto von Bismarck, who is determined to do essentially what Piedmont Sardinia has done in Italy, but in a much more aggressive militaristic fashion, and forge a German nation state behind the King of Prussia. King Wilhelm will become Kaiser, Emperor of Germany. And in order to do that, he needs to have wars. Now, initially, France is not on the horizon. So he goes to war against Denmark, which allows him to, in 1864, that allows him to engineer a rupture with Austria, who he goes to war with 1866. And astonishingly, in 7 weeks, is able to defeat Austria, which perhaps puts Louis Napoleon's own victories against Austria in the light that it deserves to be. What this means is you get the North German Confederation, so a group of North German states that join with Prussia, alliances with the Southern German states. Suddenly on France's border, you have what is going to become a European superpower, right? Just in terms of population, France, which was always in Western and Central Europe, the dominant power, and just in pure terms of manpower, right, has been eclipsed. And the French army, which has proved very successful, is a relatively small force, about 400,000. Prussia could, when it calls up its reserves, it can get about 700,000 people into the field, and that's not even including its German allies. So there was a huge debate in 1866. What should France do? Should it be neutral? Should it back Austria? Should it back Prussia? And a lot of people argue that Prussia, with a united Germany behind it, is an existential threat to France, and you have to stop it now. But Louis Napoleon, partially perhaps because of affairs, also because of failing health, is beginning to wane in his ability to command Europe in a way that it seemed like he did in the 1850s. And of course, Bismarck is an operator who is perhaps working at several levels above Louis Napoleon. Louis Napoleon sees himself as the great sort of conspirator and opportunist and practitioner of what becomes known as realpolitik, but he isn't. He meets Bismarck before 1866 and goes to war with Austria at Biarritz, which is this wonderful resort that becomes important under the Second Empire. And all Bismarck wants is French neutrality. But what Louis Napoleon really wants is to get Venetia, which he hadn't won in 1859. He wants to get some territory, maybe Belgium, maybe Luxembourg. Bismarck plays him perfectly and says, of course, if Prussia were to win against Austria, anything might be possible, without saying that anything would actually happen. Once Bismarck defeats Austria, he laughs in the face of Louis Napoleon, who's constantly demanding some kind of compensation. So foreign policy, it's been a disaster in terms of Prussia's rise. at the same time, things are going badly elsewhere. There's the invasion of Mexico, which of course is a magnificent book about which you can, which should absolutely should be bought, or indeed a podcast you could listen to if you want to find more about that. But suffice to say, it does not go well. It ends with the execution of Franz Joseph's younger brother, Maximilian, who was propped up by French bayonets. And of course, with Prussia rising, alienating even further Austria is not a good idea because you would need allies. Now, Napoleon is not an idiot. He's often presented as a buffoon. He's not an idiot. He knows that Prussia now presents an existential threat, and he says we have to reform the French army. So the French conscription is very inefficient. You've basically got a 1 in 2 chance of getting out of it. France is not a militarized country, and certainly not in the same way as Prussia is. For all the bombast of Bonapartism and Imperial Eagles and the Crimean War, Italy, Mexico, etc., it's a relatively small army now compared to Prussia. Napoleon III, he wants to reform it so that he can call up 1 million men, create a reserve with Prussia. I mean, in Prussia, every adult male goes through conscription, right? So you've got an enormous reserve to call up. As I say, in France, about 1 in 2 can avoid it. Then the middle class can buy their sons out, and to reform would be very expensive. He's also made political reforms at home, which have liberalized the empire. Interestingly, he's a sort of populist authoritarian figure who comes to power rather than going down a more dictatorial route. And his army reform is massively unpopular because the middle classes, as I say, they can buy their way out. They've got a 1 in 2 chance of getting out. They don't want a universal conscription where there's no way. They've got a chance. The army don't want it reformed because they hate change, and they believe the French army has won every battle that they fought in. And if they lost in Mexico, that was a political, not a military defeat. And so he's unable to push it through.
I think we're agreed that Napoleon III, he's not an idiot, and he must be aware that, he's seen what Prussia can do to other nations. And it's not Prussia that attacks France, it's France that attacks Prussia. It just seems an extraordinary misjudgment.
It is, yeah, and not least because we should say at this point he's very ill. So he's got a sort of smorgasbord of really unpleasant ailments, from gout to hemorrhoids. But the worst is bladder stones, which without going into too much detail, makes it incredibly hard to urinate because you literally have stones in your bladder. So he's in sort of agony, and the nature of disease is there's flare-ups where he's almost incapacitated. So that's affecting his judgment. Politically, there's been drift as well. So the opposition is rising, and in the elections in 1869, the opposition gets 3 million votes. So just remember, it's that just which goes to show how let's use the word liberal the regime is. You can vote against the regime, and the opposition candidates do incredibly well by 1869. So Louis Napoleon, in a typical coup de theatre, sort of goes through the health crisis. It looks like revolution is going to break out in Paris. There are protests, and he creates something called the Liberal Empire, which is a series of reforms that makes the empire much more democratic. In fact, the British ambassador says he's created a system more democratic than Britain. Ministers are responsible to Parliament, and freedom of the press is not entirely restored, but is relaxed, so on and so forth. He puts it to a plebiscite in May 1870, to the French people. Do you agree with these liberal reforms? Over 7 million people vote, yes, we do. And this time there is plenty of avenues for the opposition to voice their concerns, right? So this is not like in 1851. It seems like a masterstroke. The empire is back. And the first minister, he's not technically, we would call him prime minister, Émile Ollivier, he stands up in the Corps Legislatif and he says, never at any time in human history has European affairs been more peaceful. And he talks about the plebiscite victory as being the equivalent of the Prussian victory over the Austrians, i.e. crushing. And so in 1870, he is at the apotheosis, almost, the apogee of his power, Napoleon III. Nothing could go wrong. Unfortunately, we now move into one of the most spectacular self-immolations in history. So this is an arcane crisis that's been bubbling away in Spain. In 1868, the Queen of Spain had been run off the throne in another revolution, and it's been vacant for nearly 2 years. None of the candidates are acceptable to the Spanish, to the French, to other European powers. Bismarck somehow strong-arms King Wilhelm, the Prussian king, as well as the Spanish parliament and politicians, to accept a Hohenzollern. The Hohenzollerns are the ruling family of Prussia, a junior branch, who are a Catholic branch, in fact, put them on the as King of Spain. This breaks in France as a national emergency because, of course, if you've got a Prussian king on the Spanish throne and in the coming war with Prussia, which everyone thinks will become hot at some point, if not in 1870, then the French army, already outnumbered, is going to have to leave significant reserves on the Pyrenees to defend the border. So this is seen as a catastrophe. France cannot allow it to happen. So ultimatums are sent, protests are made, the streets of Paris are awash with people singing the Marseillaise, which, by the way, is a seditious revolutionary song banned under the Empire, but the government let it be sung because they want to whip up this anti-Prussian sentiment. Protests are made to the king, and it looks like it's going to be war. They're in one of these sort of typical German spa towns where the king goes. He's 73-year-old. He wants to relax away from the cares of state and being bullied by Bismarck, which is what most of his political life is. And he is desperate to avoid war. So there is a monumental climb down. He gets his family to renounce the project. France has scored an astonishing diplomatic triumph from Francois Guizot, who was foreign minister in the 1840s under the July monarchy, says it was the most spectacular diplomatic triumph he'd ever seen. And he said that, that these rascals have damn good luck because he's kind of annoyed because he's not a fan of the empire. So everything has been resolved. The diplomatic high wire act, the Second Empire has made Prussia climb down humiliatingly. When Bismarck finds out, he's furious because he'd been engineering this conflict. He wanted this war because the southern German states, places like Bavaria, are still not part of Germany. And what you need to unite Germany is, of course, hatred of the French. No, everyone can get behind that. So he's distraught. He's decides to resign in protest, and he's von Moltke the elder, the commander of the Prussian armies. He'd been looking forward to war with France his whole life. I mean, this is like his your summer holidays have been cancelled. Then France does something extraordinarily stupid, and the emperor, remember, he's not well. His judgment is impaired. But although they've got a climb down, they have no guarantees for the future. How are we to know that this same thing won't happen next year or the year afterwards? Louis Napoleon knows he's not well. He's worried about his son, who by now is sort of 13, 14. And he thinks maybe we need to deal with this before he comes of age, right? We don't want to leave his son in this Prussian threat. So they make demands to the Prussian king. They say, you must not only renounce the project as you have done, but you must promise that no Prussian member of the royal family will ever take it up again. And the king is really insulted by this because he's given them what he wants. He's like, why on earth are you doing this? So with the sort of the annoyance of a man whose holiday has been thoroughly ruined by work, he dashes off a telegram to Bismarck and says, the French are hassling me again. And Bismarck, who's having dinner with von Moltke and various other Prussian war enthusiasts, is absolutely delighted because he gets a telegram, does a few edits, puts it in the paper, and this is the famous M's telegram, where it makes it look as though the Prussian king, insulted the French ambassador, which he didn't do. He was just like, look, I don't want to talk about this. I can't give you any guarantees. But very politely, he's a very polite man. But this looks like he's insulted the French ambassador. It goes into the German papers, translated into the French. Uproar in Paris. The ambassador's honor has been insulted. And so Napoleon III brother, Émile Olivier, both of who have been quite reticent to go to war. Napoleon III, because he knows he's one of the few people high up in the French establishment, and certainly in the army, who think that war with Prussia will be difficult. He's Minister of War, famously says the army is ready, everything down to the last button. And the sooner we start the war, the better, right? Because you've got to mobilize, get to the front, and the side that does that first will win, according to the French. So there's a rush to mobilize to declare war once the guarantees are not given. France, as you say, declares war. Retrospectively, it seems absurd. At the time, even so, it's Victoria's daughter, Victoria, who's married to the Prussian Crown Prince. She is absolutely distraught because she thinks that France is going to win. Neutral opinion in Britain gives France a fairly good chance. So if you know what's going to happen, it seems absurd. But at the time, although it is a terrible decision to go to war, as we'll discuss, it's not as absurd as it seems in retrospect.
So, right. So how does it go?
It goes very, very badly. So as I say, the decision to go to war was not absurd. What is absurd is the French plan, or rather lack thereof. There's a vague assumption that because Prussia is so hated, remember they went to war with Denmark and Austria, Italy's upset about something that happened in 1866, which we don't need to go into. You should be able to get a coalition of the willing, if you will, to strangle the German baby at birth. That's not too horrific a metaphor. But this is all assumption. Louis Napoleon has not done anything to bring about these alliances. He has goodwill from these countries, but largely that goodwill has been used up because France is seen as the aggressor. Bismarck is a genius, so he actually leaks documents where Napoleon III earlier had asked to have Belgium in return for Prussian aggrandizement. And of course, in Britain, as you know from the First World War, the cause of Belgian neutrality is one that looms large in the imagination. So the British are horrified about these secret deals, and France goes into the war with no allies. That's bad enough. What's worse is that the war plan is to invade Germany, but the war plan requires Austria to make a hostile demonstration on the German border to draw German troops away. And Austria is going to do no such thing. And so the plan immediately is no longer relevant. So there's extraordinary meeting. Napoleon III, again, he says, I'm going to have to command the army, but even though he's in no state to do so, he can't ride a horse. He's in agony. His cousin Matilda comes to see him and says that, you absolutely cannot do this. You can't get on a horse. You can't lead men. And he just waves her away and says, I have to do it. He gets to Metz where his HQ is on the border with Germany. Extraordinary meeting where he turns to his generals and says, what's the plan? And they look at him, in bewilderment. There's a silence. And one of them says, well, where are we with Austria? And he says, oh, we're negotiating with Austria. And the general explodes. He says, but we must attack in days. And if we don't have Austria, we can't do it. And he says, then so the emperor says, does anyone have any other suggestions? Right? So this is, it is just farcical levels. It's staggeringly incompetent. Not only that, but the mobilization itself has gone disastrously badly. Regiments are in the wrong place. Ammunition has turned up without rifles without ammunition. No one knows what's going on. Whereas listeners won't be surprised to learn that the Prussian mobilization is done with all of the ruthless efficiency that one would expect of a German war machine that has been preparing for this moment for years. So there's a brief incursion into Germany for want of something better. They think they need to do something, and they attack a town on the border, but it's a minor engagement. The French army then decide what they'll do is and remember, the plan had been to invade. The proclamation to the army is we're going to invade Germany. And it does say, whatever road we take, we may be, sure that we'll be following in the brave footsteps of our ancestors. And that subjunctive of whatever road is not, it's not rhetorical. They don't know what road they're going to take. Soon they can't take any roads because the roads are packed with German troops invading France. The plan is simple. It's a defensive plan, and if you think about the First World War, you think this could work really well, right? Because if you can get strong positions and defend against the oncoming onslaught, then you can fight the Germans down to a standstill. The trouble is, the Prussians have developed artillery that is devastatingly effective. It can fire further and more accurately than anything the French have. So the French take up magnificent defensive positions, but those positions are overwhelmed first by artillery fire and then by larger German numbers. So you have 50, 60,000 French troops dug in. But in the face of this artillery, which they can't reply to the artillery fire because their artillery doesn't fire that far, and superior German numbers, they're overwhelmed. So they lose 3 battles in 48 hours. Germans pouring across the border, occupying parts of eastern France. And now what was already staggeringly incompetent goes into meltdown. So Napoleon III decides to resign his command, right? Because he's in no way fit to do it. So there's extraordinary moments as he's trying to visit troops to rally them, where he has to get off his horse and he's found hugging a tree, digging his nails into it, sobbing in agony because of the pain from the bladder stones. Another time where he's chairing a meeting and he starts writhing and convulsing with pain, and then just tears rolling down his face because he's in absolute agony. And he also knows that a German, 2 German armies, or possibly 3, I forget off the top of my head, have invaded France. He gives up the command. He gives it to a guy called Achille Bazaine, who's meant to be the savior of France, but he has been massively overpromoted. And all military logic dictates what the French should do is retreat to Paris with what remains of their armies, extend German supply lines, pulling up reserves, recruiting, literally anyone they can throw into a uniform. They will have more than enough men to meet the Germans, to match their numbers outside Paris, at a place of their choosing. But this is seen as a political disaster. So back in Paris, Eugénie is regent. The Minister of War there is adamant that if there is a retreat, there will be revolution. Napoleon III falls back to an army camp to regroup and try and raise another army. And Bazaine has been left in Metz to face the Germans. Napoleon III wants him to break out, but very soon he's surrounded. And so, long story short, France's only professional veteran army that is well supplied and well equipped is cut off from the rest of France. The army that's been scraped together at this military camp, that could still fall back on Paris, as indeed all military logic says that it should. But Eugénie and the Minister of War say that they must go to the rescue of Bazaine for political reasons. And when Moltke learns of this, he writes a typically Prussian understated in his memoirs. He says, a strange and somewhat foolhardy move as this army lurches towards the Belgian border on the off chance that Bazaine, the other French army, may have broken out for Metz. They've lost communication with it. They don't know whether it has or if it hasn't. In fact, it hasn't. So this is awful march where Napoleon III, who's not in command, but is with the army being dragged around, as the great novelist Emile Zola says, like a sort of luxurious baggage train. Or as Planplan, his cousin, says, it's like going into battle with a plate of soup on one's head. They end up being chased and harried by the Germans, and they are chased into a small town in northeastern France called Sedan, which is where they give battle.
And I'm guessing that the battle goes exactly as we would expect it to go.
It goes as all the other ones do. It's a defensive battle, which they don't want to fight because, as I said, of the artillery. They're also outnumbered 2-1. This is not the cream of the French army. There's some Marines, there's some elite units, and lots of reserves, and people scraped together just over 100,000. And one of the French generals who's taking part in the battle, he famously says, "We're in a chamber pot about to be shut on," which is exactly what's happened. Von Moltke has moved his armies to encircle and envelop the town. It's got a medieval fortress that was rebuilt in the 17th or 18th century, but useless against the German artillery. And the bombardment is relentless. The heroism of the French army is extraordinary. And Louis Napoleon he's out there. He's mounting a horse, which in of itself was a feat of enormous physical endurance for him, because he's in absolute agony. And he's very likely at this point, because he knows that the battle will be lost, looking for death on the battlefield. Although, as his detractors say, not that hard, because he doesn't actually die. But he does end up surrendering. By the afternoon, it's clear that this is going to be a massacre. Now, this is, I think, a heroic moment, because the first Napoleon, whenever faced with defeat, he flees, runs away. He does it in Egypt, he does it in Russia, and of course he does it at Waterloo. Get back to Paris, control the narrative. But Napoleon III says that if they carry on fighting, then thousands of men will die. So he surrenders to the King of Prussia. There's some hilarious squabbling amongst his generals because they refuse to be the ones who surrender, because it would be such dishonor. But eventually, they invaded. I think they're worse at surrendering than fighting, but they do eventually manage to get to have a ceasefire. And the Emperor of the French, Napoleon III, the illustrious Bonaparte name, has led his army to disaster, to capitulation, and to capture. So he's taken prisoner by the Prussians.
So what happens to the French after that? Do they have to surrender the whole country? Because as I understood it, there was some sort of a siege of Paris.
There is, yes. So the war doesn't end there. So Bismarck's very annoyed by this, because he thinks, I've defeated I've taken Napoleon III, Emperor, prisoner. The war should end, and the empire should stay in place as suitably chastised and weakened, which would be great for Germany, right? Problem is, when they hear news that the emperor's been captured and the army's been humiliated at Sedan, there's a revolution. The Corps Legislatif is invaded by, the ubiquitous Parisian mob, who've been fairly quiet for 20 years, but enjoy another invasion of France's parliament. And a republic is proclaimed. Now, the Republicans, when they come to power, are, as everyone is, obsessed by history. And if you know your revolutionary history of the first revolution, of course, the Prussians and the Austrians are defeated by the levy en masse, by Republican spirit, by people singing the Marseillaise. So they think they can continue the war, that the reason why they've lost is because of the incompetence of the emperor and his generals, and that a people's war against the Prussians will be victorious. They are no more equipped to defeat the Prussian onslaught than the empire was. So the war lingers on. Napoleon III in captivity, Paris under siege, and it's not till January when they start the bombardment of Paris and people are starving at a rate of, I think, about 3,000 a week, that the French Republic finally surrenders. And so the war doesn't end until January 1871. But by that point, the empire has been overthrown.
So what happens to Napoleon III after the war? I mean, he's in German captivity. Presumably the French are not too happy with him.
No.
What's his, what's
They're
his
not.
future?
They're not. No, he's as the when they get then they have an assembly elected in February. That assembly decides that one man is responsible for the ruin, the dismemberment, and the humiliation of France, and of course that one man is Napoleon III. So he is known as the man of Sedan, vilified, hated for the catastrophe. And again, this would be quite familiar history because this is where France loses Alsace and Lorraine, the two provinces that are part of eastern France today, and were under the in 1870, but are under German occupation and control until the First World War. So he's vilified and hated. While the war is ongoing, he's quite a useful pawn for Bismarck. So he's kept in a luxurious German palace, and various times Bismarck sort of threatens to send him back and restore the empire. But once the war is over, he's no more use for him. He's released, and he goes in exile to live out his days in Chislehurst in Kent, a odd place for a former emperor and one of the most powerful men in Europe, if not the world, to live out their final days. But he goes to a place called Camden House, which is today a lovely golf course. There are various. He hasn't given up, right? Remember, he's ever the optimist, and still believes in his destiny, still believes in the empire. And there are various sort of conspiracies or alleged conspiracies. Amusingly, I think from a British perspective, he goes on holiday to Torquay, and in French press, this is reported as preparations for the descent from Torquay, which probably sounds more terrifying in French than it does in English. That comes to nothing. But he issues a manifesto. He's interviewed by various journalists and papers, and in the Times, he says the French government is illegitimate. The Bonapartist plan is for and there should be another plebiscite. He thinks he's still the legitimate sovereign. He was never voted out of office. There should be a plebiscite about the form of government and who should govern France, and he would accept that. But until then, for all intents and purposes, he's still the emperor. And the rumor is he's still got terrible physical ailments and the bladder stones. And the word on that sort of does the rounds is that the reason he finally agrees to surgery, which is the reason why he didn't want surgery, is because it's incredibly unpleasant, which involves essentially inserting a metal rod into the penis to go into the bladder with a claw on it that will crush the stone inside the bladder. So you can see why he might have objected to that. He does eventually agree to undergo it by the sort of foremost physicians of the day and surgeons. The Prince of Wales doctor is consulted. There's a man called Sir Henry Thompson, who had actually performed the procedure on Leopold I of the Belgians, crucially successfully. And so he's brought in because obviously you can't do another Flight of the Eagle. This would have been his third in his mid-60s, and present yourself before the troops. By the way, it's the 1836 plan again. well, if you are being driven in a carriage, right, you have to be able to ride a horse, and he can't so much agony, so he agrees to surgery, or at least that's the rumor. But it's not the surgery that kills him. The stone is enormous. His doctor strides out after the exploratory examination and says, "What? This man rode a horse for 5 hours at Sedan? It must have been an agony," which he was. But the stone is so big, they need to do what turns out to be 3 operations. And he is kind of going in and out of consciousness, weakening. And they think he's okay for the 3rd operation on the 9th of January, 1873. And they're ready to perform it, but his condition rapidly deteriorates, and he dies. I think it's 10:45 a.m. on the 9th of January, 1873, in Camden Place, Chislehurst. It's not, I mean, the operations hastened the death, but it's actually kidney disease, which killed him. He had organ failure because his kidneys had stopped working, and he had chronic kidney disease for a long time, but undiagnosed.
So we don't reckon it was incompetent surgery that killed him.
No, it's a good 19th century scandal. All kinds of rumours and counter rumours go about the incompetence of British surgeons. Of course, lots of people in France are not that bothered if they have killed him. It's although Bonaparte there was a renaissance, and in the 1870s it's a serious electoral force. And who knows? Maybe there could have been a restoration. But he would have died. He would have died not long after he died. The operation, it's just the stress that put on his body accelerates something that would have happened weeks later, according to the doctors.
Okay. So I feel we've kind of said enough to say that Napoleon III, an extraordinary man and a chancer and a in some ways a fantasist, but nonetheless a serious man, seriously intelligent man, and a man who gets a lot done. But he I don't know, maybe it's just because I'm British. I'm very unfamiliar with him until recently. And I get the sense that the French, presumably, they don't want to talk about him except in harsh terms because of the humiliation of 1870. But has that sort of poisoned his reputation because the French won't support their own man?
It's an interesting one because the when he dies, the British obituaries are broadly very positive because he was a great Anglophile. He'd lived in London, and he did the Crimean War. He also signed a commercial treaty with Britain, very famous at the time, 1860 Cobham Chevalier Treaty that brought lower tariffs between Britain and France. And free trade was one of the great kind of popular rallying cries of that period, right? So he's seen as very affectionately in Britain, and they all say one of the great names, not because he's Napoleon, but because of his power, has passed from history, and he'll be remembered. But he's not, as you say, he's forgotten. And I think you're right. It's partially because in France they tried very hard to forget him. He's vilified, and then as a criminal whose regime began with an illegal act and ended in spectacular disaster, as a tyrant. So he's vilified and then he's forgotten. And he's passed out of popular memory in French history, despite the fact that he was in power longer than any other 19th century ruler in France. And if you take his presidency, 1848, to the overthrow of the empire in 1870, you've got nearly 22 years, right? So that's more than his uncle, more than the French kings before him. I think it's Louis XV is the last French ruler to rule longer in the mid 18th century. If he's remembered at all in France now, and a lot of people don't know that there was a third Napoleon, as they don't know that here, it's as an insult. So occasionally French presidents are compared to Napoleon III. That is not meant to be a flattering comparison. Although in the case of Hollande, it was because of the secret trysts from the Elysee, I think was the main point of comparison. And the Third Republic, which replaces the Second Empire, we're on the Fifth Republic now, which has in this week is sort of teetering on the brink. So who knows? Perhaps there'll be a third empire. But the Third Republic, which is currently France's longest lasting republic, still a few years on the fifth one, is set up as a prophylactic against Bonapartism, if you will. It's designed to stop a strong man coming to power. So the president of the Third Republic is not directly elected, is elected by the parliament, and has very weak powers. So his main legacy on French politics is for sort of 70 years of rather ineffectual, weak government, which comes to kind of characterize the Third Republic, because they don't want a directly elected president. And of course, the Fifth Republic is sometimes compared to the Second Empire, in that you have a president with almost monarchical powers. Certainly in foreign policy, there are referendums, but I mean, it's largely referred to that as to insult it. It's Charles de Gaulle, who's instrumental in setting it up, is not reading, Louis Napoleon's pamphlets.
And so we had a Napoleon I, we had a Napoleon II, who's just, flitted in and out. And Napoleon III, who we've talked about. Did they ever get round to having a Napoleon IV?
Well, Napoleon IV is the Prince Imperial, Napoleon III's son, who has even more bizarre, death place rather, even more bizarre than his father, because Bonapartism continues, and he is the pretender, right, to the throne. And if you never give up should be the Bonaparte monarchy motto, right? But he hasn't done anything to kind of warrant his position as leader of the party. So he thinks, what better way to gain military renown than to take part in the Zulu War in 1879 as part of the British Army. So he'd been a cadet in the Royal Artillery, another good Bonapartist tradition. And when the war breaks out in 1879, he's desperate to go and fight. And Victoria, the Queen Victoria, is against it, but he usually appeals to her and strings support. And he goes out to fight in the Zulu War, although crucially not to do any fighting, because the last thing you want is Napoleon IV being killed in British Army uniform, hugely embarrassing. But he talks his way into getting into these reconnaissance missions that are kind of reconnoitering the invasion route that the British will take through Zululand. And it's because of his he's not the commanding officer of the group, but because of his name and because of his, kind of reputation, or I suppose the Napoleonic reputation, it's sort of unclear who's in charge. And they're out hard day riding. They stop to rest near a sort of small abandoned Zulu village, and they're sitting down and under the South African sun, having a wonderful time, and showing that he's very much his father's son, for two reasons. One, he's discussing Napoleon Bonaparte, the first Italian campaign of 1796. The other reason is that he's shown remarkable military ineptitude, and there have been no sentries posted. They are not ready to go should they be ambushed, which is exactly what happens. Out of the long grass comes a Zulu war party, about 30 or 40. Spears are thrown, rifles are fired. They miss everything in the rush, but it panics the horses. So some of the British soldiers manage to remount and flee. Napoleon IV, unfortunately, is unable to get on his horse, the wonderfully named Percy. Percy is startled, runs off. He manages to grab onto the saddle, and he's hanging on desperately, trying to either stop the horse or mount the horse. But after 100 yards, he can do neither, and loses his grip on the saddle, tumbles to the earth, turns around and sees about 10 Zulu warriors approaching him. Reaches for his sword. It's come off as has fallen out, so it's yards away. He can't get it. Very sensibly, in my opinion, he decides to run. He hurt his arm in the fall as well, so he's probably got a broken arm, right arm, which is his better arm, and zigzagging to avoid the spears being thrown at him. But as he gets down into a sort of ravine, he sees his comrades in arms are fleeing into the distance. So there's no chance of catching them up, and he decides that it's better to turn and fight. So he turns around, draws his revolver with his weaker arm, fires off a few shots, which all miss wildly. And as the Zulus close, a spear goes into his leg, which he pulls out, uses that to defend himself, but it's 10 men against one, and eventually a spear goes right through his eye into his brain, and that's what kills him. And he's found the next day by a British search party, who are understandably disappointed with the British officer when he tells them that he's lost Napoleon IV in a fight with the Zulus, and they find his body stripped naked except for a medallion which he had from his father, and which has got the seal of the Napoleon I as part of it, a miniature portrait of Eugenie. And the rather touching vignette that I learned reading accounts of his death is that they find one blue sock with N for Napoleon emblazoned on the side of it. The bloody grass where he's discovered. So that's Napoleon IV. That's his end. He dies in South Africa. He's brought back, obviously, the body is brought back to Britain, but Eugenie, who's in Camden Place in Chislehurst, she's so distraught by his death, and the place has too many sad memories for her, that she moves to a place called Farnborough Hill, outside what is today Farnborough. If you've ever been to Farnborough, you won't be surprised to learn that most of Farnborough didn't exist when she moved, and she built this wonderful French sort of neo-Gothic church as a mausoleum and as a crypt, where the bodies of Napoleon III and Napoleon IV, should you wish to, if you're a Bonapartist, and indeed Eugenie, are now buried on the sort of outskirts of this, well, how should we say, architecturally uninspiring new town that has built up around it in the 1960s. I don't want to disparage Farnborough, but it's a contrast to the Second Empire.
Yes. Okay, so I guess we should bring it to an end there. That's the sad end of the Bonaparte dynasty and the end of this podcast. So Edward Shawcross, thank you very much indeed.
No, not at all. Thank you. I didn't think we'd make it. So much to discuss. I'm glad that we somehow managed to bring it to an end.
Okay, well, thank you again.